Off to a little bit of a rocky start as the price on Bitcoin itself crashed, and the country, of course, had a little bit of trouble rolling out that payment system. Joining us right now to talk a little bit more about this is Bitcoin enthusiast Joe Weisenthal, who, of course, has been following this rollout for us. Joe, obviously, you do a lot more than that, but you certainly know a lot, not only about Bitcoin, about this whole ecosystem here.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to what you generally expected from the start of a country, even though it's a small country, using this as legal tender.
You know, it's hard for me to imagine that the existence of another currency will itself amount to this big transformation. But it would not surprise me if at the margins, or maybe to a substantial degree, it does bring in foreign direct investment. Obviously, a lot of actual Bitcoin enthusiasts, investors, technologists in the space are very excited about what's going on there. And so the idea that perhaps they could set up shop in the country as miners, developers, and so forth, perhaps also Bitcoin tourism, it would not be surprising if one effect is to essentially bring in more outside capital.
We know, obviously one of the most important things here will be for other countries thinking about this, Joe, some of the learning that happens here. What are you watching most closely? What do you think will be most interesting about how this works and who uses it and what the challenges are?
Well, I think it'll be really interesting to see, a few things. One is, do people use it as a spending currency, or most people in the U.S. and developed markets who own Bitcoin mostly own it as an investment, so that'll be interesting. There's also interesting technological questions, the degree to which people find it easy to use the various solutions that are being developed, whether it's the government's wallet or another wallet. That'll be really interesting to watch, because that might inform whether other countries try to adopt something similar. So I guess just usage patterns in general, what apps and how, whether it's spending, investment, those will all be interesting things to track.
All right, I want to bring in Nick Carter, partner at Castle Island Ventures. Nick hosted a chat on social with the president of El Salvador, encouraging him to adopt Bitcoin not long before the country did exactly that. So, Nick, we won't say that it was your brainchild, but certainly you were part of the conversation with the leadership there. What are you watching most closely here now that they have taken this step?
Well, I'm curious to see the extent to which second layer networks like the Lightning Network actually get utilization. Apparently, it looks like the official Chivo app will support this overlay network. And so I'm very curious, as Joe says as well, to see whether Salvadorans actually embrace Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. Yeah. So far, the evidence is that Salvadorans are mostly bemused about the move, but it'll be very interesting to see if they actually use it at merchants.
Well, that's what I'm curious about, Nick. I mean, obviously there's the Bitcoin faithful, and then you have some institutions that see the investment opportunity within it. But of course, trying to convince just average people on the ground to use this in a transactional way has to be a bit of a hard sell. And we've seen some data showing polling out of El Salvador saying something like 70% of the public doesn't really want this thing. How do you overcome that? How does this country sort of mount that type of public perception in opposition to something that they seem to be tethering their future to?
Well, I'd be surprised if Bitcoin became the dominant medium of exchange in the country. I expect dollars to be the predominant solution for the foreseeable future. It is a little bit surprising that the Bukele administration has pushed Bitcoin as a medium of exchange so firmly, when at the sovereign level, it seems like the most obvious thing to do would be to adopt it, in their foreign exchange reserves as kind of a gold-like analog, whereas at the brick and mortar merchant level, Bitcoin is not a popular tool, nor has it really ever been. So it's a little bit surprising to me to see their emphasis in sort of, that transactional mode.
Nick, what do you see as the upside scenario here for? So obviously, look, a lot of Bitcoiners such as yourself have been very enthusiastic, very excited about this news. What does success look like, either for Bitcoin or, more importantly, what do you think if success could mean for El Salvador?
Well, for El Salvador, they're going to have to normalize their relations with the international institutions like the IMF. There's a lot of uncertainty that they need to be resolved. Investors in Salvadorian debt are pretty concerned. And so I'd like to see yields come down a little bit. But generally speaking, I think a relatively smooth rollout. The Chivo Wallet appears to be working. It's in the App Store, so sort of in theory it works. It would be, I think, damaging to the effort if the Bukele administration started to enforce Article 7 in the law really aggressively against merchants that didn't offer Bitcoin, transaction settlement. So as currently conceived, this law is actually more of a forced tender than a legal tender law, and it actually mandates merchant acceptance. If they start to enforce that really aggressively, I think that would be a pretty significant optics blow for the Bukele administration. It might trickle down to Bitcoin as well.
Nick, obviously there would be a lot of kind of process learning here, but in terms of sort of the argument for the possibility, it's there. What would you expect to see larger countries, more kind of globally integrated countries, adopting Bitcoin in this same way anytime soon?
Perhaps not embracing it as this medium of exchange, which, as I've said, is a curious approach, but as a sort of non-sovereign digital gold-like asset that you can hold and use to diversify your exposure away from sovereign currencies like the dollar. To me, that seems like the most obvious approach. El Salvador, to be clear, is probably not the first sovereign state to hold Bitcoin on its balance sheet. It's certainly rumored and quite plausible that states like Iran, Venezuela, or North Korea all hold Bitcoin in some capacity. They're the first ones to do it explicitly, though. But yeah, as Bitcoin becomes more of this gold-like asset and fully undertakes that process of maturity and financialization, that's where I'd expect to see uptake. As central banks potentially look for this sort of non-sovereign asset that they can hold.
But just to be clear, Nick, so when you talk about uptake, you're talking about these central banks sort of building that up in its reserve, or the Treasury in its reserves, to a level that I guess would maybe by default just sort of force uptake?
Yeah, that's what I would expect to see in terms of sovereign adoption of Bitcoin. None of us really expected that the first nation to fully embrace Bitcoin would do it in terms of encouraging it to become a dominant medium of exchange.
So do you think there's going to be another country? I mean, actually, more importantly, like Bitcoin hasn't gone anywhere in a long time, price-wise. It went down quite a bit since the highs earlier in the spring. Then it's bounced back. Like, what is the next big catalyst you're watching for? Was it more on the national side? Is it something on an ETF? Like, what do you think is going to be the next thing that gets people excited about Bitcoin? Because even with the recent crypto rally, it seems like people are really more excited about like Solana or like buying a JPEG of an ape.
Well, you have to consider in context, and I think it's those macroeconomic drivers that are really going to determine the next few years of Bitcoin's future, effectively. If we get this kind of sustained monetary repression with negative real interest rates, I think assets like Bitcoin continue to look attractive to investors. Bitcoin itself doesn't really have to change much. It's sort of quite well understood. And of course, there's things like an ETF, which would be further financialization, make it suitable for other market participants to get exposure to. But that's pretty incremental at this point. I think it really just depends what's happening out there in sort of the broader macroeconomic environment.
We know that there is, plenty of review happening at the SEC and elsewhere from a regulatory point of view about cryptos in general and their use and their applications. What do you think? Where do you think we are, and how does this, if in any way, change the thinking by the SEC, for instance, in the legitimacy of these products and how they will be used by perhaps even the Federal Reserve?
Well, SEC Chairman Gensler understands Bitcoin very well, and I think his opinion of it is sort of fully complete. And he's, I think carved it out as something that's truly decentralized. He's made statements to that effect. Now, the remainder of the crypto space, especially decentralized finance, some of these crypto banks, lenders, seem to be in his crosshairs. I think the SEC is a more activist SEC. It's just fundamentally more active than the prior SEC, and has a number of sort of litigations undergoing, including with Ripple. And Gensler has made some pretty direct and aggressive statements about the decentralized finance space. And I think the whole industry is kind of expecting some sort of reprisal there, although we don't know exactly what form it's going to take yet.
Would a reprisal towards decentralized finance be bad for Bitcoin because it would say, oh, all of crypto is in the crosshairs, or would it be good in the sense that non-Bitcoin crypto is largely viewed as a regulatory arbitrage play that then gets stamped out?
It's a great question because Bitcoin is not the dominant collateral type in decentralized finance, although it is somewhat involved. Any reprisals might concern platforms or exchanges where, of course, Bitcoin trades as well, and so it might affect the liquidity profile. But it's a good point. Bitcoin is somewhat distinct from the broader decentralized finance movement. That said, I think investor pessimism would percolate throughout the whole industry and probably adversely affect Bitcoin at the same time.